My name is Tom Wright. I'm a senior fellow and director of the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. It's my great pleasure to welcome you this morning to our discussion on, does Russia's invasion of Ukraine mark the end of the post-Cold War order? After months of preparation and posturing on the Ukrainian border, Russia launched a full-scale invasion last week in an event I think that is one of the most significant, if not the most significant, since in Europe and for European security since the end of the Cold War. All week we have seen very traumatic scenes of the Russian attack and a valiant Ukrainian effort to resist the invasion. The West has rallied around Ukraine and presented a united front, unfolding ever more strict sanctions, including this past weekend on President Putin, his inner circle, Russian companies, and the Russian economy more generally. To discuss what's happening right now and also to take a bit of a wider lens on the geopolitical significance of the invasion, I am delighted to be joined by a really stellar, distinguished group of Brookings experts on Russia and Europe. We have a really terrific panel. Pavel Bayev, who is a senior research professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo and a non-resident senior fellow with us at Brookings. Steve Pfeiffer, who is the William J. Perry Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford, also a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, for many years a resident senior fellow at Brookings, and importantly a former US ambassador to Ukraine. Angela Stent, who is a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, was until recently a professor at Georgetown University, is the author of many books on Russian foreign policy, including, I think most recently, Putin's World, which I highly recommend to everyone. Constanze Stelzenmüller, who is our senior fellow, a Fritz Stern chair, blanking for 1 second on the formal title, a Fritz Stern chair and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and our resident expert in everything Germany, but also generally on transatlantic relations. Doug Redeker, who is a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, an expert in sanctions, held many senior positions in the international financial world, and also runs international capital strategies. And last but not least, Jim Goldgar, who is a professor at American University and a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. So welcome all of you on this fairly momentous week. We've been talking about these events, predicting them for some time, obviously following them very closely. It's moved even more rapidly, I think, than one might have thought at the beginning. And Steve, if I might sort of start with you, since the eyes of the world are fixated on Ukraine, I would say there's been really a groundswell of international support for the Ukrainian people, and the Ukrainian government, maybe in a way that wasn't quite anticipated by the analytical community, and certainly by Russia. Many expected their forces to collapse quite quickly. That has obviously not happened. They're resisting ferociously. Could you just give us maybe the benefit of your insight as someone who served as the US ambassador to Ukraine, who's been to Ukraine outside of that countless times, has written extensively on it. I guess my question is, are you surprised by how Ukraine has reacted, and what is your sense, based on your contacts there, of the mood and the strategic assessment now, and what their military and political objectives are in the weeks ahead?
Well, thanks very much. No, I think you've seen a remarkable transition, and it really goes back 8 years to the Maidan Revolution, in which Ukrainians made very clear they want to be in Europe. And it's also, of course, with the Russian annexation of Crimea, then the conflict in Donbass. I recall back in 2014 talking to Ukrainians and said, Vladimir Putin has succeeded where centuries of Ukrainian nationalists have failed. He's actually created a strong sense of national identity in Ukraine, and he's imbued it with a strong anti-Russian sentiment. And I think the last 2 weeks and this conflict are only making that even tighter. I was in Kyiv a month ago, and there were still these petty disputes among political parties. They've all come together now. Volodymyr Zelensky, I think there were questions about some of his policies. He has emerged really as a true wartime president. Just contrast the pictures we saw a couple of days ago. Zelensky's out there having tea with soldiers. And then there's Vladimir Putin meeting with his minister of defense and the head of his general staff, and they're sitting 30 feet away. But looking at this as a conflict, people have often said Russia cares more about Ukraine than the West does. And that may be true, but they tend to leave Ukrainians out. Ukrainians care about Ukraine a lot. And I think they see this as an existential struggle. If they lose this, they lose a lot. They lose democracy. They're going to be like Russia. They lose Europe. They lose their hopes of one day becoming a normal European country, fully integrated into the European Union. So I think you've seen a fight that's going on with both skill and determination. And the Ukrainians have a sizable military, about 250,000 people in active duty, 400,000 veterans, a lot of those who are now in the territorial defense. And we've seen over the first 6 days that I think they have succeeded in slowing the Russian advance from what many people might have projected, say, a week or two ago. Now, I think the Kremlin is surprised by this. It does seem that the last 2 days there has been a pause on the Russian side as they reorganize. And while I think there's a sense of optimism after the last 6 days for the Ukrainians, I think we need to bear in mind that the Russian military still maintains significant advantages in mass numbers and modern weapons. And the concern now is, with the Russians having failed in what were relatively small probes to try to get to Kyiv, do they now resort to more brute force tactics? Do we start seeing something that we saw already yesterday in Kharkiv with mass missile attacks on the city? It's going to be hard for the Ukrainians to win. I think the Ukrainians are open to a negotiation. A couple of days ago, Zelensky suggested even we might be able to talk about neutrality guarantees. But I think what the Ukrainians are offering now is not enough for Putin. So I don't see a lot of prospects for negotiations. Now, I guess my last observation would be is, at the end of the day, the Ukrainians may not be able to win in terms of stopping the Russians and having the Russians leave. But it's hard for me to see how the Russians win, and I use win in quotation marks, because even if the Russians achieve what appears to be their maximalist objective, which is to take Kyiv, depose the current government, and then put in place a pro-Russian government, what happens next? Any pro-Russian government the Russians install in Kyiv lasts 2 minutes after the Russian military leaves. So the Russians may be setting themselves up for a lengthy occupation with a hostile, angry, in many cases, armed population. And it could be fairly ugly. I think the Ukrainians will continue to resist. Part of that will depend upon the brutality of a Russian occupation, but I think it will continue. And as I said, this is going to be a long story to play out. It's going to be a tragedy for Ukraine, but I think it's also going to be a tragedy for a lot of Russian families who are not going to see their loved ones coming home.
Steve, thank you. Fascinating. Angela, if I could come to you next for the other piece of this. I mean, Steve talked about Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian people. You're a lifelong sort of student of Russia and Russian foreign policy, and have written extensively on Vladimir Putin's foreign policy and mindset. And I guess the question really is, how do you think both he and sort of the Russian security leader looking at things now? I mean, he laid out a view over the past 9 or 10 months, which basically amounted to that Ukraine wasn't a real country, it was sort of made up. And he had a lot of positive, optimistic assumptions from his point of view about how Ukraine would sort of fold and collapse. But things haven't quite gone, obviously, as he would have expected. So what's your sense of the mood and the calculations in Moscow this week? And can you maybe take us out a little bit in terms of what you think his objectives are now?
Well, thank you, Tom. So I think we have some idea of what his objectives were in the beginning, because the Russian government, one of the Russian government websites, RIA Novosti, the media organization, prematurely published an article 2 days after the invasion began, and they may have written it beforehand, saying how easily Ukraine had surrendered, that the Ukrainians really wanted to be reunited with the Russians, that we're going to have a completely new world order now, the Anglo-Saxons are finished. This article has since been taken down from the website, but I think these were obviously their orders, and it's interesting to see, what they thought was going to happen. The war isn't going well for the Russians, or as well for the Russians as they had hoped. It's clear that President Putin was misinformed by some of the military around him about how easily the Ukrainians would surrender. And we don't know whether that's because they themselves are misinformed, or whether they knew that this is what Putin wanted to hear. But there's clearly an issue here about the information he's getting and what he wants to believe. We now see, unfortunately, the beginning of much more indiscriminate bombing of civilian targets. Because it's been much harder for the Russians to conquer Ukraine than they thought it would be. I'm reminded, if we're looking at Putin's mindset, how did he come to power? Just shortly after he was named prime minister, he launched the second war in Chechnya. And if we think about what happened then, what did the Russians do? They leveled Grozny, the capital city of Chechnya. So you wonder whether this is part of Putin's playbook now, is just bombing, destroying, if we see what's happening in Kharkiv. And these tactics are going to get more brutal, and civilians are clearly being targeted. And the other analogy, if we're thinking about Putin, is if we assume that what the Russians are trying to do is to surround Kiev and maybe starve it out. You do have the analogy with what happened in the siege of Leningrad during World War II, something that Putin himself is acutely aware of since his parents went through it. So it seems that the tactics are much more brutal because Putin is determined to succeed. And for him, success would mean taking Kiev, subduing Ukraine, and installing a puppet government there, although I completely agree with Steve. On day 2, if there are no Russian forces there, this puppet government is finished. And a longer-term occupation of Ukraine, I think, is not something that Russia has calculated with. Now, China has, for instance, now offered to mediate. Other countries have offered to mediate. Is Putin at all interested in mediation? And we can't see any evidence of that. I mean, there were talks between Ukrainians and Russians on the Belarusian-Ukrainian border, ceasefire talks. They really didn't amount to much. The fact that a former culture minister from Russia was sent to lead the delegation, I think, tells you about how serious it is. So I see no interest at the moment from the Kremlin in any kind of an off-ramp. The sanctions that have been imposed, I think that they were far more than Putin had reckoned with. He's apparently very angry about them. There are obviously the personal sanctions against him, but of course the sanctions against the banks. Doug Rediker will be talking about that, but he looks upon this, and as a result of this, right, just after they were all announced, he then announced this sort of vaguely defined special alert for Russia's deterrence and nuclear forces. But this is menacing. This is out of the Putin playbook. He's now threatening the West and anyone who helps Ukraine. He was explicit about this, that there is the nuclear option there. And suddenly, in the past few days, you've had lots of people talking about what this means. Would he really consider using tactical nuclear weapons in this fight? We don't know. But the fact that this nuclear option now is on the table, again, very vague, and the US, I think, responded correctly by, we didn't put our forces on alert, and President Biden tried to play it down. Again, it shows, I think, about his state of mind. And there is increasing repression inside Russia. Just yesterday or the day before, the one remaining independent radio station, Echo of Moscow, that's existed, since the Soviet Union collapsed, was taken off the air, and other opposition and not opposition sites have been taken down. So what's happening is a greater repression, and it's impossible now to find information about all of these protests that are going on. But I have to say, I'm amazed that so many thousands of Russians have taken to the streets to protest this war. My final point here is, again, as we see Putin determined to crush Ukraine, is his state of mind. And there is much more discussion now about what he's thinking. Why is he acting like this? There are questions about his health and things like that. I just put that out there because you hear rumors about reports about his increasingly paranoid way of thinking. And I was reminded when he became president in 2000, he gave a series of autobiographical interviews. And in one of them, he describes living in a rat-infested apartment in Leningrad where he grew up. And as a child, deciding that he was going to corner one of the large rats, and the rat then attacked him. And so in that book, he says, the conclusion I drew from that is you should never corner someone because they can hit back, and you should hit back before you are cornered.
Well, he is definitely, he seems cornered, but we will see what his hit back is, and we'll come back to this later, particularly the nuclear piece, which I want to get everyone's thoughts on. But Pavel, we'll move in a minute to the response. But Pavel, you're an expert on Russian defense policy and the Russian military. Could you talk to us a little bit? I guess what has surprised you, especially in terms of the performance of the Russian military so far, but also where do they go from here? I mean, it's widely expected, and we've already seen it begin, a much more sort of brutal offensive and indiscriminate, offensive in Ukraine. But what's your sense of sort of the tactics and the morale and really the depth, that Putin has to sort of tap into? How much can he assemble this force? But how much can he sort of mobilize, Russian society, and where do you think sort of the military picture is headed in the weeks ahead?
Yes, Tom, these are important questions, and probably in the immediate picture of things, they're crucial questions. But first, if you hear me all right, I will continue. If there are problems, I will switch off my video. I think this war never had a chance to go according to plan. The plan was exposed by US intelligence pretty accurately. And we know about the concentration of forces, and we know about the kind of main directions of their assaults. But I think nobody thought that by the end of the first week of the war, we would be where we are, because nothing effectively is happening on the battlefields. Russians are not really able to achieve much except some territorial gains in the south. Two crucial points in this aggression are certainly Kiev and Kharkiv. And what we see around Kiev, I think, generally tells you that the Russian assault on this huge urban center is pretty much impossible. There is no capacity to surround it. There is a single supply line which goes for kind of miles and miles towards Belarus, and it's completely stuck. All logistics effectively is not moving. So surrounding Kiev is really a task too far. Kharkiv is a different story. It's much closer to the Russian border. It's much more exposed. It's much more difficult to bring Ukrainian reinforcements there and Western weapons, so to say, which are now coming into Ukraine increasingly. It's easy to deliver them to Odessa. It's possible to deliver them to Kiev. Kharkiv is a different story. I think that is the crucial point in the current battles, and it is in many ways a very Russian-speaking city. It's really part of that more pro-Russian, traditionally Eastern Ukraine, and it's holding very firm. It's holding absolutely, and again, Russians are trying to undermine morale of the defenders by delivering selective strikes. We are not speaking about kind of massive bombing. We are not seeing anything resembling an attempt to erase the city like Grozny was erased, or Aleppo for that matter. There are still very few, not particularly well targeted missile and air strikes intended more to instill fear, to undermine the will to resist. And they are achieving exactly the opposite result. So it is in many ways a very counterproductive strategy. And the main issue here is about the real strength of these Russian battalion tactical groups. It was easy to count them. It's clear from every satellite picture where the tanks and artillery positions are. but the will to fight is much more difficult to assess. And at least a half of the personnel in these battalions are young conscripts who are expected to be discharged in March or in April. And now instead they are pushed into the war without any explanations, without really any indoctrination towards the war, because all they were told through the winter is about exercises. What they were told again and again, suddenly they are in the war. And I don't think there is much will in the Russian battalions for attacking. It takes a lot of motivation really to go into urban fighting. I don't think this motivation is there. And besides street fighting, every time a soldier is loading an artillery gun and firing into the city, there is a bit of a thought in his head. What am I doing? What is this? So I think every time they try to connect with their families back home, every time they speak with their comrades, many of whom has relatives in Ukraine, I think the morale is eroding very fast. So every day where nothing much happens in the battlefield, except for some strikes, tragic as they are, is a big win for Ukraine, is a big setback for Putin's plan for this war. And that is why he's trying to resort to his ultimate argument with nuclear weapons. And it is pretty much a hollow bluff, truth be said, because putting your strategic forces on this very vaguely defined extra level of readiness doesn't mean anything for the war. As far as non-strategic and tactical nuclear weapons is concerned, they are still stored in centralized storages. There are a few of them, about a dozen, and they are there for 30 years. Nobody in the ranks has any experience in handling them. There are certainly protocols and procedures, but delivering them from these storages to the real weapon systems is a colossal risk of human error, is a colossal risk of accident. You are really taking chances with these weapons, and I don't think in the militaries there is much enthusiasm really for going across the nuclear threshold on this battlefield. So I think so far it is still very much an attempt to undermine the morale and the will to resist in Ukraine with this very flawed expectation that it's not a real state. You push it a little harder, it will break apart. And this ideological proposition really informs the strategy, and the strategy doesn't work. And there is no plan B, and there is no interest in trying something else. So I think the war is stuck, and this can continue for another week. And I don't think we are looking into a protracted conflict simply because the material resources in Russia for protracted war are not there. So it might be much shorter conflict than anticipated by many Western experts.
Thanks, Pavel. And one thing I think we need to pick up later, we want to move to Europe and NATO and the response now, but one thing we want to pick up later, I think, is, if all of that is true, then what does Putin do, right? I mean, what's his play now? Because he's presumably not just going to step down and retire, right? So, what's his move? Constanza, if we could turn to you next, and this invasion, I think it's fair to say, came as a surprise to many governments in Europe. They heard the US intelligence, they were a little bit skeptical. I think they did basically absorb and accept it, but they also thought that it seems the invasion will be somewhat limited. But what we've seen really over the last week is an extraordinary sea change in European security and in Germany, in your own country as well. I mean, you've been a very close student of transatlantic relations, but also European security. Often, I think it's fair to say, sort of arguing, that they should take much bigger leaps than they were willing to do. And you've been making these points for a long time. What is your sense just of how do you sort of think about this, if you agree, this, you know, extraordinary sort of catalyst? And a second question is, what do you, the same I asked the others, really, what do you think the strategic calculations are now in Europe about, and in the EU, about where we are headed? I mean, there's been the tough response, but where do you think they want to go from here?
Yeah, all complicated questions. Thank you very much. You know, I was in Germany in late November, early December, and spoke to some people. And people, you know, with access to intelligence information in Germany, had a very bleak assessment of what was to come even then. I have to say that I came back convinced that those who were dreading the worst were right. The problem is that the security tribe to which I belong, and which, as you say, in Germany has been saying for really decades, that we need to change the way we define, conceptualize, and implement national security. We're facing an uphill battle against those who found it very convenient to outsource security to America, energy to Russia, and export income to China. It was a great deal for Germany, particularly since EU and NATO enlargement had two fantastic results for German prosperity and safety, which was that we acquired an enormous value chain hinterland in Eastern Europe. The Eastern European economies are profoundly integrated with that of Germany. And we also pushed out all of our security problems from what used to be the inner German border to Eastern Europe's periphery, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, leaving Germany's citizens in the blithe conviction that somehow the arc of history had bent in our direction, and that we were now being rewarded for having gotten atonement and reconciliation right, and that everybody was now going to be like us instead of us, you know, previously trying to become civilized members of the world community. That was a very hard narrative to push against. For those, of course, who were studying what was happening, it was always clear that it couldn't last and that we were going to have to do something. And I would even say that Sunday's developments, dramatic as they were, you know, weren't completely unpredictable. As some of you on this call know, I've been saying, and boring many of you by saying that, in my view, German attitudes to security, at least among those who dealt with these issues professionally, had begun to change quite significantly ever since the Russian attack on Georgia in 2008. But again, the problem was turning that into national policy, and policymakers in government telling the public that this was necessary, and that what was needed was a seismic shift rather than very slow incremental changes. Let me just perhaps briefly recapitulate for those of you who unaccountably don't obsessively study every element of German news. We shut down Nord Stream 2. The company operating Nord Stream 2 has just declared insolvency a few days ago. I haven't even found time to celebrate that. The promise to increase the German defense budget to 2% of its GDP immediately. In other words, yes, it's a promise to keep a promise. But given the fact that in the last 4 years, I think our defense budget went from 33 billion euros to 50 billion euros, that's a really big additional promise. We've already done something fairly astounding with our defense increases under the last Merkel government, but this is an even bigger shift. On top of that, 100 billion euro as a sort of starter injection of capital to make the shift happen. That is something that I'm now reading in German newspapers. Chancellor Scholz discussed only with his finance minister, and when he announced it on Sunday at a special session of the Bundestag, his own parliamentary group, the Green parliamentary group, his vice chancellor and his foreign minister were first informed of this decision, which is astounding. Then the decision to build 2 terminals for liquid natural gas. As of now, we have none. The opposition leader, Friedrich Merz, chimed in, said, of course, we're going to do this. And we won't dispute, we won't engage with you in pointless disputes about details. We are going to be, in this sense, a loyal opposition. And even the co-leader of Die Linke and the quite left-wing parliamentary group leader of the SPD chimed in saying it's very clear that Russia is the aggressor here, and that has to have consequences for our national security. That is an astounding shift in Germany's culture. And to quote a piece in this week's Die Zeit newspaper I used to work for, the SPD has just thrown 30 years of pacifist foreign and security policy overboard. The Greens have finally kicked pacifism adieu. The Liberals, the finance minister, Lindner, who was a notable fiscal hawk, saying goodbye to fiscal conservatism, saying this is a time to spend rather than to save. And the CDU, the opposition, Merkel's party, saying not everything was good that happened in the 16 years of Merkel's tenure. And unlike the Munich consensus of 2014, remember when Germany's then president, foreign minister, and defense minister got on the podium one after the other and said German security policy has to change, it has to become more responsible, but were notably silent on the details of how this was going to happen, and therefore could not be held to any benchmarks of later implementation. These are very specific promises that this government can be held to, and apparently is determined to be held to. Now, so much for what happened on Sunday, but of course we all know that it is going to be extremely difficult for this government to manage a climate transition, an energy transition, a historic inflow of refugees, and a historic defense transition at the same time, at a time when, as my colleagues have suggested, we are looking at a protracted, nasty, brutal war, Russian war of attrition against a free and sovereign country on our borders. Promises have been made of offering Ukraine EU membership. That, I'm afraid, is an empty promise. It's just not politically, technically feasible, not with a country that is at war and being occupied. But what the EU has done, let me retract so nobody gets me wrong. I am absolutely for saying to Ukraine, we will do everything in our power to help you now. And we are doing everything to make sure you come out as the winners of this conflict. And then we will talk about EU membership. And we do it in such a way that you can manage it and we can manage it, in the hopes of achieving a transformation at the end of which the question answers itself. But I think the far more important gesture that's being currently made is that every Ukrainian refugee can come to the EU without having to submit to the onerous asylum procedures and stay for 3 years. And my understanding is that there are now discussions about offering the same to Russians who want to flee persecution in Russia. And that, I think, is apart from sending weapons to Ukraine, apart from humanitarian aid, probably the most important signal that we can send. That anybody who is persecuted by Putin can find sanctuary in Europe and a life in peace and productive employment. And I think that's the best signal we can send to the world. That's not to say that I don't have grim predictions about how this conflict could still involve Western forces, how it could still be carried to NATO territory. All of us, I think, can imagine that, but that's perhaps for later discussion. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Constanza. Thank you. Doug, if we turn to you next and then to Jim, some commentators have described the sanctions response as total financial warfare, on Russia. We certainly haven't seen anything, like this before against a country as large and as significant, as Russia. How I guess the two questions are, is that right? I mean, how historically significant is this move? And if I may, because we only have till the top of the hour, just jump into as well. Where does this end up? Like we're seeing a concerted punishment strategy, but what if we play the tape forward, a month, 6 months? What do you think the end game or the different sort of versions of this are as we go forward?
Thanks, Tom. Actually, your questions are exactly what I'd written my notes to follow, so I'm on the right page, I guess. First of all, you said these are an act of war. Yeah, I would say if we weren't in the era in which the word nuclear is being used in a literal context, then for those of us who sometimes use the word nuclear as a figurative description of just how big something like a sanctions package is, then I'd say this is going down the route of the nuclear option on sanctions. But again, since we're talking nuclear, I'm just going to say it's a big effing deal. These are huge sanctions, not only on their face, but because of the unexpected nature of the coordination with Europe and other G7 and even non-G7 countries. Just to give a sense, not only is historically neutral Switzerland on board, but even Monaco has joined in some of these sanctions. When you get Monaco to take on Russian oligarchs, you've got unprecedented global unity. So it's not just the nature of the sanctions, but in fact, the scale and the scope of the unanimity of those who are supporting it. Let me go to your question about what the purpose is and what happens next. Because where we are now is effectively what I would describe as pre-détente Cold War economic landscape. So this is about as bad as the relationship has been between the US and Russia / the Soviet Union in many, many decades. People forget how isolated the Soviet bloc was from the Western economic sphere in the bad old days. And that's kind of where we are today. So it gets to your question about, well, where do we go next? And the problem is sanctions can play multiple roles. They can be a deterrent. Well, that didn't work because we are where we are. I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying that the deterrent strategy is to preempt something, and where we are is where we are. Then you've got the punishment aspect. And I think that's what this primarily is. There was a sense, both for setting a precedent on the global landscape, but also in the context of what Russia has done, that you need to punish. There needs to be retribution. There needs to be a price paid. In fact, I would argue going after some of the oligarchs in such an overt fashion is not necessarily a means by which to seek to change behavior, but it's to say enough is enough. We've tolerated this for 10, 20, 30 years, enough. But then that gets to the where do you go next with this? And as we've heard from some of the previous speakers on this morning's panel, Putin is boxed in. He's in a corner, however you want to describe how he got there or where he is. There doesn't appear to be much of an off-ramp left for Putin. And I don't think that these sanctions are coming off anytime soon. Let's just be clear. I don't see a scenario in which there's a negotiated outcome in which some of the sanctions, whether they are against the central bank, whether they are against individuals, whether they are against the banks, whether they are against any of the tools that have been already used, whether we say, well, we will now go back and reverse those if you if you stop the invasion, if you stop the bombing, if you stop the hostile actions. I don't think that's really on the table, which means that Vladimir Putin is in that corner, and the sanctions part are not being structured as a negotiating leverage tool. They are being used, I think, as punishment. That doesn't mean that there won't be a negotiated outcome, though I'm not sure I see where that comes. But the sanctions don't seem to be structured to achieve that goal. Let me just throw one other thing in, because I know we're a little short on time, which is to say the export controls that we have imposed, and most of what I described earlier, the banking sanctions, the central bank, the oligarchs, have been done in coordination with all of the G7, the EU, the UK, and other countries. That's been a huge multilateral success and an effort. But the export controls that the United States effectively is imposing under its own laws are unbelievably important over the longer term. And to not bore everyone, the short summary means anything that has a high-tech component in it that contains US intellectual property or other inputs, and that's basically everything on the high-tech side, has now been restricted into Russia. That's not going to impact iPhones. It's not going to impact daily life. It's not intended to do that. But what it does is effectively take away the option for Vladimir Putin's next economic model, post-fossil fuel, the famous Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country line. And we have now taken that AI, high-tech next phase of economic development off the table. Because what we've done is limit the import, not only from the US, but from any country in the world, of those necessary tools by which the Russian economy can develop. That's a huge, though medium to longer term impediment to Russia's economic growth. And I go back to my earlier point. I'm not sure how you roll that back. So if you're Vladimir Putin, there's not a lot that you look at in what has been imposed on the sanction side that gives him a sense of, well, maybe if I lighten up over here, I'll get some relief over there. It's a very serious package. And I don't see a lot of ways to get off this track. The last point I'll make is China, which is the one actor here that a lot of people are pointing to as the release valve for Vladimir Putin's economy. I think that that is true, but only in very, very small number. China is not a substitute for any of the areas that we have cut Russia's economy off from, neither financial nor economic. Obviously, they can continue to export oil through the global markets, and China will be a ready, willing, and able buyer. There's some financial ruble and renminbi trade that can still be facilitated. But make no mistake, China is not the sanctions-proof escape valve for what we and our G7 allies have imposed on Russia. This is big. This is going to hurt. And again, I'm not sure what the end game is. It seems to be more punitive than it does to create negotiating leverage. But make no mistake, without going back on what I said earlier, in sanctions world, this is the nuclear option.
Thank you, Doug. Jim, you've been super patient, so thank you. But I was hoping we could sort of zoom out the lens a little bit. Certainly, if you have any comment on what has gone before, but you're a historian of NATO. You've written extensively on that, but also on the post-Cold War, period, as well as sort of following, obviously, and analyzing, contemporary events. But I'm wondering if you could put on your historian's hat for a minute and tell us a little bit how you think about the moment we're in. I mean, it feels like the end of one era and the beginning of another, certainly the clarification, of an era that we maybe already, entered. But is it a new Cold War? Is it something else? And what do you think, looking at the different ways this could unfold, what do you think the different futures are that we could be headed into? And I would just add, just before you answer that, if anyone has any questions, you can mention them on Twitter with hashtag Russian invasion, or send them to events@brookings.edu. We have a few coming in already, which we'll get to in a minute. But Jim, over to you.
Thanks. Well, what a great discussion we've had. It's great to learn from all of my colleagues. So, I think now it's really hard even to remember back to how much high hopes we had in the early 1990s about the prospects for a US-Russia relationship, about the efforts that NATO made to reach out to Russia and establish the NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997, in the hopes of reassuring Russia that whatever NATO was doing on the continent of Europe was not directed against Russia, but was seeking to create more stability and security across the continent. And I think most importantly, to realize that absent Putin's aggression against Ukraine in 2014 and after, and of course now, at a just, a much higher level, what would we have seen? We would have likely seen the NATO sort of drift, lose its sense of purpose, the animating issues of the early 2000s, enlarging NATO across Central and Eastern Europe, the war in Afghanistan. I mean, these had largely ended by then. There wasn't really much, that same kind of animating sense of purpose. The United States really would have pivoted to the Indo-Pacific, as it said it wanted to in the early Obama administration, and would have lost much more interest in Europe. And I think we really would have seen something very different. What has Putin done since 2014? I mean, he's united NATO, and he's really united NATO now. The 2% pledge that we talk about, NATO members spending 2%, aspiring to spend 2% of their GDP on defense by 2024, the pledge that was made in the summer of 2014. I mean, that came about after his invasion of Ukraine that year. And we would not have expected, we were not expecting the Germans to meet that 2% goal anytime in the foreseeable future until this current invasion. The rotation of troops, NATO troops into Eastern Europe, the exercises, the efforts to reassure the Eastern members of NATO, we wouldn't have had any of that absent the 2014 invasion. And so now what do we have? Now we have an even greater sense of unity and purpose. In recent years, of course, Turkey's relationship with the West had become quite fraught. Lots of concern about the Hungarian leader, Viktor Orban's relationship with Putin and cozying up to the Russians. And look today at the kind of unity we're getting within NATO, within the European Union, both of which include Hungary as a member. The populations of Sweden and Finland showing greater interest in NATO membership, and Sweden and Finland sending military assistance to Ukraine. Never would have imagined that taking place. And a US that's deeply engaged in Europe and in ensuring security in Europe and standing up for NATO allies. I would have, a year ago, if you had asked me what the president would be talking about on foreign policy in a State of a Union address in 2022, I would have said, well, of course, the competition with China and the way and would have utilized sort of the growing bipartisan sense of concern about China and China's growth, China's impact on the world, using that to try to create some sense of unity in the United States. We didn't hear anything about China last night. We had, this was about Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and the way in which this issue has created, at least around that, some sense of bipartisanship. So I think that we are really in a different era. The 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, which the countries have an important sense really stuck to the NATO countries, in that there was an effort to reassure the Russians that there wouldn't be a permanent stationing of troops in the member country from the West into the member countries that joined in 1999 and after. And that's why we've seen the rotating troop deployments throughout the Eastern members. I think we should see the declaration that the Founding Act is dead, that Russia has violated all of the efforts, all of the provisions to create a better NATO-Russia relationship, and in fact that reassurance of the Eastern members requires a permanent stationing of troops on their territory to reassure them. And I think we, whether we call it a Cold War or not, It certainly will be some kind of version of containment of the type that we saw during the Cold War, where we try to ensure that Russian aggression is contained, that it does not spread to other areas of Europe. And, hopefully in this case, with the assistance to Ukraine, that the invasion that we've seen in the last couple of weeks, that this can be reversed in some way.
Thank you, Jim. That's a terrific sort of segue to that larger question. We do have a number of questions in. We don't have very much time because we did say we just keep this to an hour, but we've had, obviously a lot of panelists and really terrific contributions. So I would just ask everyone to keep, treat it as a lightning round, very complex questions you could talk for 10 minutes about, but try to maybe just give a very short bites in response, and come to Angela and Pavel on this one, and then I have others for our other panelists. But the question is from Garrett Mitchell, who asks, I think this is on a lot of people's mind, is there any basis for thinking that a prolonged and problematic invasion in Ukraine might leave Putin in danger of a coup? Are there key figures who might be persuaded to lead such an effort? So without, getting those prospective plotters in trouble by outing them here, Angela, if we could start with you, what is the possibility of political change in Russia, and is that a little bit of a pipe dream that maybe we're clinging to, or is there a real, chance of something happening?
Well, I always hesitate to make any predictions about things like this because Russia can always surprise. And we look obviously at Putin now, and he seems to be in firm control. Again, greater repression than ever. But of course, there could be cracks. So the answer to that is, of course, it's possible. You wonder, and one has heard some rumors about that, whether all of the people in the top brass of the military really think that what's happening at the moment with this invasion of Ukraine was a sensible or wise or the right thing to do. And a few weeks ago, there was a group of retired army officers who published a criticism, this is before the invasion, but criticizing Putin and saying that they should not attack Ukraine. I couldn't tell you whether there's any one single figure out there who would be a potential alternative to Putin, so I think I'll let Pavel do that.
Oh, that is a hit below belt. What an interesting twist to that question is what Putin thinks about it. And I think he is really in a situation of high anxiety, because in his mind, and it's probably correctly, every one of his aides, every one of his ministers, and every one of his siloviki wants him out. That would be a solution to the problem. And the problem grows larger every day as the war continues to be stuck. So what Putin himself thinks about it, how he perceives that, his inner and outer circles, that is an interesting, I wouldn't begin to imagine his state of mind here. The only person in his entourage who has his own perspective, own support base, longer experience in politics than Putin himself is Sergei Shoigu, Minister of Defense. He is a very experienced courtier. He knows how to show loyalty, but also in his previous experiences as the Minister of Emergency, he has seen a lot of man-made disasters. That is a unique perspective he has. So if there is any person who Putin is particularly concerned about, that's probably him, and with good reason. But I think the larger question is that this regime cannot survive a defeat. It's just plain impossible. Putin's stakes are so high, and everything is bent on achieving some sort of success, and the success remains elusive. He has no possibility to retreat, even to compromise. It would signify defeat, and what sort of shape and form this defeat will take, how this regime will collapse, that is a huge question. Now we're all concerned about Ukraine, and Ukraine is a tragedy. I think our next concern will be about Russia, where there is a looming catastrophe.
Thank you, Pavel. That's terrific, Steve. There's a question here, and again, I asked you to be super brief. It's something you could talk about for 10 or 15 minutes, but Florian van Oppenheim asks, how do we balance the conflicting interests of A, the West supporting Ukraine now and offering EU membership, and B, efforts to achieve a ceasefire through compromise? This is a crucial, question, I guess, in terms of the sort of any prospect for diplomatic, outcome. There's military assistance, obviously, but the military analysis is still pessimistic for Ukraine's chances there. So how do you sort of see this?
I think that's one of the big questions, but at this point in time, based on the signals you're seeing out of Moscow, I'm pretty pessimistic about the chances to negotiate a ceasefire. And when you look at the two sides, where's the overlap? I mean, right now it appears that the Russian objective is to take Kyiv, depose the government, and put in place, somebody else. How does the government in Kyiv compromise on that? So I think it's going to have to. There's going to have to be some more changes, and we'll have to see what happens on the fight before you get a position from the Russians that could actually allow for a real negotiation.
Thank you, Steve. Really appreciate the succinctness as well. Constanza, the question from Fred Hodder, which I think is also on people's minds: how feasible are indictments by The Hague in the near term, but also more generally? Obviously, I know you have a legal background, very interested in sort of the international law part of this. At the same time, the ICC is constrained in what it can do with the major powers. So how do you see this part of it?
Thank you for that question. This is where I put in a plug for another Brookings event. The Breyer Lecture, the annual Breyer Lecture this year, will be given on April 8th by the acclaimed author and international lawyer Philippe Sands on war crimes, genocide, and ecocide. He will tie together these and other current questions of international criminal law. I will just say for the moment that the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, has just announced 2 days ago that he is opening a line of forensic inquiry into war crimes committed in Ukraine. The problems that you point out are real. A member of the Security Council has a veto against cases, the bringing of cases in the Hague, so Russia can conceivably stop such proceedings. But I think that creative ways will be found to collect forensic evidence and create a historical record, and perhaps create a body of evidence against such a day when it might be possible to have a Russian government that would be cooperative in pursuing criminal cases against perhaps the former leadership. Remember that in the 90s, it was thought completely impossible that this could ever happen with Yugoslavia, and you ended up with Slobodan Milosevic in front of the Hague court. I'm aware, of course, as a lawyer, of the legal and political complications of such moves. I am aware that the pursuit of international justice can sometimes conflict with the pursuit of peace. But as has been said here before, the current Russian president appears not to be willing or able to find any common ground with Ukraine to negotiate a peace that is not based on the annihilation of Ukrainian democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Constanza. We're just about out of time, but I want to ask Doug and Jim one more lightning round question. If you can stay, if not, no problem at all. But Doug, and again, this falls in the category of very complex questions, but to have a short answer to. But is there any? You mentioned that the sanctions are unlikely to be lifted, and I think that's right. But is there any way to use them sort of strategically so they can be, calibrated in some way as part of a negotiation where there could be an exchange for, a ceasefire. There could be some easing of it. How complicated is that to do? And do you think leaders are sort of thinking about how they might be, used in a relatively flexible way to achieve a political outcome?
So the answer is, it is probably possible to do it, meaning from a technical means, you've got executive orders and the EU's directives that have imposed these sanctions. So if there's a political will to actually, dangle the ability to roll them back, I think that is possible. I just don't think it is plausible, because now that you've created not only what Costanza was describing as this, predicate for international condemnation and potential criminal investigation, how do you actually now say, well, okay, to the oligarchs, well, we are going to say, maybe you can have some of your ill-gotten gains if Putin decides to roll back the invasion? How do you say maybe we'll allow you to exchange some of your hard currency for a little bit of rubles to maybe provide a little bit of intervention to stabilize the decline in the ruble? How do you say maybe we'll let your banks do a little bit of transactions on the international markets? I mean, it's just, we've gone into, as I say, an economic Cold War, and it's hard to go into that detente phase without there being a significant undermining of the premise of where you started. If Putin is not there, then yes, I think some of those could be put on the table in a post-Putin regime. While the current regime is there with the agenda that they've espoused, I just find it hard to imagine how you structure it, even if legally it's possible to do so.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Jim. If we could give you the last word, and I guess my sort of question goes back to the State of the Union last night, where we saw, remarkable unity on Ukraine, remarkable unity on NATO. As we've spoken about many times in our meetings in Brookings and elsewhere, over the last sort of 10 years, there's a sense that in certain quarters in the US, there's sort of less commitment to the transatlantic relationship. I mean, clearly the president is a committed Atlanticist, but the country, has increasing challenges in China. There's some support for pulling out of NATO, or at least decreasing US commitment to NATO on the Trumpian side. Is what happened sort of a real pivotal moment in terms of, a greater US or a continuing US commitment to Europe and NATO? Do you see this, as a moment where that has sort of crystallized, and we will see the transatlantic alliance remaining sort of a core piece of US foreign policy, regardless of election outcomes here, or is that still in play?
Yeah, I think it's quite remarkable. And, last year I was pointing out that if you went back 30 years to the end of the Cold War, you would have found that Europe and Russia were central to US foreign policy, and the US policy toward Europe and Russia was about Europe and Russia. The whole effort to create a Europe whole, free, and at peace, the effort to build a strong relationship with a democratic Russia. And my point last year was that US policy toward Europe and Russia wasn't about Europe and Russia at all. It was about China. President Biden talked about creating a stable and predictable relationship with Russia. The whole goal there was sort of a quiet Russia that allowed the United States to really focus its attention on China. And the policy toward Europe was about what can Europe do for us in the competition with China. And now what we're seeing again is policy toward Europe and Russia focused on Europe and Russia. This constellation, this unity of purpose with NATO allies, really recognizing the importance of the transatlantic relationship. And of course, unfortunately, compared to 30 years ago, when the goal was to create a positive relationship with Russia, it really now is about trying to contain Russian aggression, prevent further Russian aggression, and to try to stand up to Russia in order to, hopefully at some point change its own orientation, and so that we can get a different kind of relationship, as Doug was just talking about. But I do think the one concern I have about all of that is that it does put the United States back into playing. I mean, it's important for the United States to play a major role in Europe right now, but we didn't want to get back into a situation where the Europeans had that sense of dependence once again on American security, and America was providing the primary means of security for Europe. I still think it's important for Europe to develop what's been called strategic autonomy, or what we could call strategic capability, to be able to take more of security issues on their own. But that's now, right now, Europe needs the United States engaged, and the United States, I think, will continue to remain engaged as long as we have this threat posed by the Russian regime.
Jim, thank you very much. Thank you to all of our panelists, Doug, Steve, Jim, Constanza, Pavel, and Angela. This is a topic I am sure we will come back to pretty soon, either in this format or on Twitter Spaces, which we're doing now relatively frequently. Thank you all for joining, and with that, we are adjourned.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.